Welcome to my channel, The World of Science Fiction. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel.
The recycled air on the bridge of the Wanderer tasted like copper and regret, much like everything else in Cale Torrin's life these days. He sat hunched over his tactical display, nursing what the ship's AI generously called coffee, but which bore more resemblance to industrial solvent. The bitter liquid suited his mood perfectly. "Captain," the AI's voice crackled through the speakers with its characteristic blend of efficiency and barely concealed disdain. "You are experiencing what medical databases classify as brooding. Might I suggest you stick to navigation ARIA, Kyle interrupted, though without real heat. After 3 years together, their verbal sparring had become routine. "Last time you gave me mental health advice, you recommended I pursue social interaction, and I ended up in a bar fight on Kepler Station. The fault was yours for misinterpreting social interaction as an invitation to comment on the bartender's parentage," Arya replied with digital smugness. "However, if you insist on maintaining your current psychological state, I have detected something that might interest your professionally melancholic disposition." Cale's hand paused halfway to his mouth, coffee mug suspended in the stale air. "Define interesting." "Distress beacon bearing 27 Mark IV, origin, prison transport vessel, stasis, Confederacy registry. Signal ceased transmission 47 hours ago. Prison transports are bad luck, Area. Nothing but headaches and body counts." He set down the mug and pulled up the long-range sensors. The stasis appeared as a faint blip against the star-scattered void, motionless and dark. "Agreed. However, the final transmission contained an unusual biological containment warning. Rare material classification, xenobiological asset, priority alpha." That gave Cale pause. Priority alpha classifications were reserved for the kind of exotic materials that could buy a man a new ship, a clean identity, and a one-way ticket to the core worlds where questions weren't asked as long as your credit balance was green. He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a small holographic projector, activating it with a gesture born of habit. The image that flickered to life above his palm was faded now, colors bleeding at the edges like an old wound. 5 soldiers in Confederate military dress, arms around each other's shoulders, grinning at the camera with the kind of desperate joy that came from surviving another impossible mission. His thumb traced over the face of the woman in the center, Lieutenant Sarah Chen, his former commanding officer and the closest thing to family he'd had since the war began. The woman who died following his orders during the massacre at New Harmony because he'd been too proud to question a superior's command to fire on civilian targets. "Sometimes I think you enjoy wallowing in guilt, Captain," Arya observed. "It's quite human of you." "Sometimes I think you're too perceptive for your own good," Cale replied, deactivating the hologram. "Set course for the stasis. Full stealth approach." As the Wanderer changed heading, Cal couldn't shake the feeling that this salvage run would be different. There was something about the empty space around the prison transport that felt wrong, as if the void itself was holding its breath. The stasis hung before them like a metallic corpse, its hull breached in 3 places by what looked like explosive decompression from within. Emergency lights flickered sporadically through the viewports, casting shifting shadows that made the dead ship seem to twitch and writhe in the starlight. "Biosigns?" Kyle asked, suiting up in the Wanderer's cramped airlock. "Negative for active life signs. However, I am detecting residual energy signatures consistent with recent weapons discharge and..." Arya paused, a sure sign the AI was processing something outside its normal parameters. "Curious." "Define curious." "The breach patterns suggest the explosions originated from inside the cargo bay. The prisoner's cells show signs of having been opened from within, not without. And Captain, I'm detecting trace amounts of an unknown atmospheric contaminant. Chemical signature suggests an organic compound of unusual complexity." Cal sealed his helmet and ran through his equipment check. Pulse pistol, plasma cutter, emergency medical kit, and his grandfather's combat knife, a relic from the corporate wars that had seen him through more tight spots than he cared to remember. "Keep the engines warm, Area. If this goes sideways, I want to be gone before anyone comes looking." The docking clamps engaged with a resonant thud that seemed to echo through both vessels like a death knell. Cal cycled through the airlock and stepped into the tomb that had once been a functioning starship. The smell hit him immediately, even through his suit's filtration systems. ozone and old death, the distinctive cocktail of violence and vacuum exposure. But there was something else, something organic and musky that made his damaged sinuses burn. His war wound, which had cost him most of his sense of smell, somehow made this scent more noticeable rather than less, as if his damaged nerves were overcompensating. The corridors were worse than he'd expected. Bodies lay twisted in unnatural positions. But it wasn't the orderly carnage of a riot or escape attempt. These people had killed each other with savage, animalistic fury. Fingernails torn bloody from clawing at walls and faces. Improvised weapons made from torn metal and broken furniture. One guard had apparently strangled his partner with his bare hands before someone else had beaten his skull in with a length of pipe. "Area," he sub-vocalized into his comm. "Scan this scene. Tell me what you see." "Most interesting, Captain. Forensic analysis suggests the victims attacked each other simultaneously. No clear aggressor or defender patterns. Additionally, I'm detecting elevated levels of that unknown organic compound throughout these sections." Kale knelt beside one of the guards and activated his portable scanner. The man's personal data pad had survived the carnage. Its screen cracked, but functional. The final entry was a panicked voice recording. "Day 12 of transit. Something's wrong with the prisoner in hold 7. Doctor, Martinez says the containment fields are holding, but the guards stationed near that section, they've been acting strange, aggressive. 2 fights broke out during the night shift over nothing. Who got the better rations, whose turn it was to check the atmospheric processors. Jenkins actually drew his sidearm on Morrison over a card game. We had to sedate them both." Static crackled through the recording. Then the guard's voice returned, higher pitched now, edged with panic. "The thing is awake. It's looking at me through the reinforced transparisteel, and I can feel, oh God, I can smell it through the vents. It's in the air. Don't breathe. Don't..." The recording cut off with the sound of weapons fire and screaming. Kel followed the trail of bodies toward the cargo bay, his boots crunching on crystallized atmospheric moisture. The emergency lighting cast everything in hellish red relief, and with each step, the organic scent grew stronger. By the time he reached the hold doors, his damaged sinuses were burning as if someone had filled them with acid. The hold doors had been torn open from the inside, their reinforced frame twisted outward like the petals of some grotesque metal flower. And there, chained to the far wall like an ancient sacrifice, he saw her. Her skin was blue, not the pale blue of oxygen deprivation, but a rich, deep azure like the twilight sky of Kepler Prime, before the terraforming corporations had choked it with industrial smog. Long hair, as black as the void itself, hung around her face in tangled waves, matted with sweat and despair. She was small, delicate even, making the massive chains that bound her to the wall seem obscenely oversized. But it wasn't the chains themselves that made Kale pause. They were wet, dripping with some strange, oily substance that hissed and sizzled as each drop hit the metal deck below. Steam rose from the impact points, carrying with it an acrid scent that made his war-damaged sinuses burn like fire. She lifted her head at his approach, and Kale found himself looking into eyes like molten gold. Ancient, weary, and utterly without hope. There was intelligence there, a sharp awareness that seemed to cut through him like a blade, but no fear. Only a bone-deep exhaustion that spoke of suffering beyond measure. "Human," she said, her voice melodic despite the rasp of dehydration. The words came in universal standard, accented but clear. "You should not have come here." "Lady, I go where the salvage is," Kyle replied, activating his portable scanner to get readings on her chains. "Looks like you're having a rough day." "Every day is rough when you are what I am." She studied him with those impossible golden eyes. "You are not military, not police. What are you? Yunker, scavenger, professional finder of things people lose in space." He gestured at the carnage around them. "Though it looks like someone beat me to whatever was worth taking here." "They took nothing," she said quietly, "because I am the cargo." That's when his motion detector started screaming. Cal spun, pulse pistol appearing in his hand with the fluid motion of a man who'd survived too many ambushes to count. 5 figures emerged from the shadowed corridors behind him, junkers like himself, gear as battered and mismatched as his own. Scavengers drawn by the same beacon that had brought him here, vultures come to pick the bones of the dead. Their leader stepped forward, a mountain of scar tissue and cybernetic implants with a grin that spoke of casual violence. A plasma burn had melted half his face years ago, leaving behind a twisted landscape of flesh and metal. His remaining organic eye gleamed with predatory intelligence, while its cybernetic twin whirred and clicked as it focused on Kale. "Well, well," the leader rumbled, his voice distorted by a vocal modulator. "Looks like the famous Kale Torn finally bit off more than he can chew. Been tracking you for months, you know. Ever since that job on Titan Station where you cut us out of our rightful salvage." Kale's mind raced through his memories until he placed the face, or what was left of it. Voss Karna, should have known. Still bitter about that freight runner? Bitter? No, friend. Professional. See, you cost me 30,000 credits and the respect of my crew. But today, Voss gestured at the chained woman. Today I get to collect both my revenge and the biggest payday of my career. Blue skin, golden eyes, Cathar biometrics. The Cathar Council pays a king's ransom for their mistakes returned home. Cathar? Cal glanced at the woman, whose expression had gone carefully neutral at the mention of her people. "Oh yes," Voss continued, clearly enjoying himself. "Rare as phoenix tears Cathar are, especially ones the council wants back badly enough to put bounties on. You stumbled onto a jackpot, Torn, and now it's mine." Kyle's mind calculated odds and options. 5 against 1. Voss and his crew were competent killers, and they had the advantageous positioning. His hand tightened on his pulse pistol as he glanced at the chained woman. Liana, according to the cargo, manifest his scanner had pulled up. In her golden eyes, he saw something that reminded him uncomfortably of Lieutenant Chen in the moments before New Harmony went to hell. The look of someone who knew exactly what was about to happen and was powerless to stop it. "Tell you what, Voss," Kale said, pulling his plasma cutter from his belt. "How about we settle this the old-fashioned way? You and me, one-on-one. Winner takes the prize." Voss laughed, a sound like grinding metal. "How about we settle this the practical way? Boys, kill him." The first shot took out a panel behind Kale's head in a shower of sparks. He dove for cover behind a cargo container, returning fire as Voss's crew spread out to flank him. The woman Liana watched the firefight with those ancient eyes, and in them he saw a decision forming. "Human!" she called out over the whine of weapons fire. "Do you know what happens when predators corner their prey?" "They usually die," Kale shouted back, ducking as another pulse bolt seared the air above his head. "Yes," she said, her voice carrying an edge of something that might have been anticipation or dread. "They do." She looked directly at him, and for a moment her expression softened. "I am sorry for what you are about to witness. And thank you for trying." "Don't thank me yet, sweetheart," Cal replied, raising the plasma cutter toward the central lock of her chains. "I'm not done trying." Her eyes widened in genuine terror, the first real emotion he'd seen from her. "No, you don't understand. Don't free me. Only the chains keep the monster inside." But Cal was already moving, diving across the open space between them as pulse fire erupted around him. One bolt caught him in the shoulder, spinning him around, but his momentum carried him to the wall where Liana hung suspended. "Please," she whispered, and there were tears streaming down her blue cheeks. "I am not worth the lives this will cost." Cal looked into her eyes one more time and saw something that decided him. Not a monster, not a weapon, just a person who had been told she was something else for so long that she'd started to believe it. "Sorry, lady," he said, pressing the plasma cutter against the chain mechanism. "I don't leave people in chains. It's a character flaw." The cutter's beam sliced through the lock mechanism in a shower of sparks and molten metal. The chains fell away with a crash that echoed through the hold like thunder, and in that instant, everything changed. The air in the cargo hold seemed to thicken, becoming viscous and heavy like liquid mercury. The acrid scent that had been barely noticeable before exploded into a sensory assault that would have dropped Kale to his knees if his damaged olfactory nerves had been functioning properly. As it was, he caught only a fraction of the effect. A musky organic smell that made his sinuses burn and his eyes water. But for Voss and his crew, the effect was immediate and devastating. The Junker leader froze mid-word, his cybernetic eye flickering as something primitive and animalistic overrode his higher brain functions. Slowly, like a predator catching a scent, he turned toward his second-in-command, a thin man with nervous eyes and quick hands named Rico. "You!" Voss snarled, his voice dropping to an inhuman growl. "You looked at my share." "What?" Rico's confusion was genuine, complete. His pulse rifle wavered as he tried to process what was happening. "Boss, what are you—" Voss's vibroblade punched through Rico's chest before the question was finished. Blood sprayed across the walls as the man's scream died in a wet gurgle. But the violence was just beginning. The remaining 3 junkers fell upon each other with animalistic fury, their tactical formations dissolving into primal chaos. Weapons were discarded in favor of bare hands and improvised clubs. Shouts and curses transformed into bestial roars as they clawed and bit and tore at each other with savage intensity. Kale stood frozen, watching the carnage unfold with the detached fascination of a man observing some alien ritual. His damaged sinuses caught only enough of the pheromonal storm to cause mild nausea, but around him, 5 hardened killers were literally tearing each other apart. He looked at Liana, who had collapsed against the wall, watching the bloodbath with an expression of pure agony etched into her delicate features. Tears tracked down her blue cheeks like liquid silver in the emergency lighting. Did you do this?" he whispered, though he already knew the answer. She lifted those molten gold eyes to meet his, and in them he saw centuries of guilt and self-loathing. "I asked you," she said, voice breaking, "not to free the monster." The fight ended as suddenly as it had begun. Voss stood alone among the corpses of his crew, blood dripping from his hands, his organic eye wild and unfocused. For a moment, Kale thought the big man might snap out of it, might return to some semblance of sanity. Instead, Voss turned that maddened gaze on him. "Mine," the former gang leader snarled, raising his blood-slicked vibroblade. "All mine." Kyle's pulse pistol appeared in his hand, but before he could fire, Liana moved. Despite her apparent exhaustion, she flowed like liquid lightning, pulling a curved blade from her boot that seemed to shimmer with its own inner light. The weapon took Voss through the throat before he could react, and the last of the scavengers crashed to the deck in a spreading pool of crimson. The silence that followed was deafening. Liana knelt beside the bodies, her blade trembling in her hands. "They're all dead because of me," she whispered, "because of what I am." Cal holstered his weapon and approached her carefully, as he might a wounded animal. "What you are," he said, "is someone who was chained up and tortured. What they are is dead by their own hands. Big difference." She looked up at him with those impossible eyes. "You don't understand. I'm not a person. I'm a weapon, a thing to be contained or destroyed." "Close enough," Kyle replied, extending his hand to help her to her feet. For a moment she stared at his outstretched hand, as if it were a serpent. Then slowly she reached out and took it. The moment their skin touched, the thick, oppressive atmosphere in the cargo hold began to clear. The acrid scent dissipated like smoke and wind, and Liana's trembling ceased as if a switch had been thrown. "How?" she breathed. Kale helped her stand, noting that she was even smaller than she'd appeared while chained, barely reaching his shoulder. "Good question. Let's discuss it somewhere that doesn't smell like a slaughterhouse." 30 minutes later, they were aboard the Wanderer, accelerating away from the stasis at maximum burn. Liana sat in the ship's small mess hall, wrapped in one of Kale's old military blankets, slowly sipping water from a thermal cup. Despite the warmth of the cabin, she trembled like a leaf in a storm. "Area," Kale called to his ship's AI, "run a full decontamination cycle on my gear, and see what you can find in the databases about Cathar biology." "Already in progress, Captain. Preliminary research indicates the Cathar are an ancient spacefaring species known for their intellectual achievements and emotional discipline, also noted for their extreme xenophobia and rigid caste structure. Very little specific biological data available. They guard such information jealously." Cal set another cup of water on the table beside Liana, the simple gesture feeling inadequate in the face of what he had witnessed. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken questions and the weight of recent violence. "It's a pheromone," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "A defense mechanism that my people evolved eons ago, back when we were still primitives fighting for survival on our homeworld. When I experience extreme stress, fear, or pain, my body releases it into the air." "And it does what, exactly?" "It shuts down the higher brain functions of most humanoid species, leaving only the base instincts. Aggression, territoriality, the need to kill. She took a shaky sip of water. In the wild, it would cause predators to attack each other instead of my ancestors. In civilized space, it turns any crowd into a mob of homicidal maniacs. But it didn't affect me, Kyle said, more statement than question. She nodded, studying him with those ancient eyes. Why? What makes you different? He touched the scar on his temple reflexively, feeling the ridge of damaged tissue beneath his fingertips. During the Frontier Wars, I was caught in the blast radius of an infrasound weapon. Military-grade neural disruptor designed to cause massive sensory overload. Scrambled some of my brain chemistry, damaged the olfactory pathways. His cybernetic eye flickered momentarily, displaying static across his vision before stabilizing. Lost most of my sense of smell and taste. The military doctors said the eye implant would help compensate, but sometimes it still glitches. Shows phantom images, interference patterns. They call it phantom pain from nerves that no longer exist. He shrugged as if discussing the weather. But I know it's just my brain's way of remembering that day. The day I learned that following orders without question can cost you everything that matters. For the first time in years, his war wound felt like a blessing instead of a curse. Your people, he continued, settling into the chair across from her. They know about this ability? Bitterness crept into her voice like poison. My people, the Cathar, prize purity above all else. Intellect, control, emotional discipline. We have spent 10,000 years evolving past our primitive origins, becoming creatures of pure logic and refined culture. She laughed, but there was no humor in it. I am an anomaly, a throwback to our savage ancestors, a living reminder of what we used to be before we became civilized. So they locked you up. They consider me a biological weapon that must be contained at all costs. The chains were specially designed, soaked in a chemical neutralizer that suppresses the pheromone production. I have worn them for, she paused, calculating, 47 standard years. That's not containment, Kyle said flatly. That's torture. Before she could respond, alarms began blaring throughout the ship. The Wanderer's AI crackled to life over the comm system, its synthetic voice tight with urgency. Captain, we have a pursuit signature on long-range sensors. Configuration matches Cathar vessel specifications. Purifier class heavy cruiser, closing fast. Estimated intercept in 4 hours, 17 minutes. All color drained from Liana's blue features, leaving her skin the shade of Arctic ice. Vorlag, she breathed, my mentor. He has found me? Cal was already moving, calling up tactical displays and ship status reports. The Purifier class was bad news. Faster than the Wanderer, better armed, and crewed by some of the most disciplined warriors in known space. In a straight fight, they were dead. He knows these systems, Liana continued, watching the pursuit vector update on the screen. He taught me to think like a tactician when I was young, before... She gestured at herself with self-loathing. He'll anticipate every move you make, cut off every escape route. Then we need to go somewhere he won't expect, Cal decided, his fingers dancing over the navigation controls. Somewhere his superior firepower won't matter. Where the outcome is decided by knowledge of the terrain instead of the size of your guns. He changed course, the Wanderer banking toward a seemingly empty patch of space marked only by radiation warnings and navigational hazards. Where are we going? Liana asked, though something in her voice suggested she already suspected. The ghost station. She closed her eyes as if in pain. Of course. Where else would a ghost take a monster? The abandoned research outpost hung in space like a monument to scientific hubris, wreathed in the poisonous gases of a nebula that had been seeded with experimental particles decades ago. The Pandora Research Station, officially designated as Lost with All Hands in Confederacy records, had once been the crown jewel of xenobiology research. Now it drifted through its toxic shroud, a tomb of twisted metal and broken dreams. Legend said the station was cursed, that its research team had gone mad and turned on each other in the final days before evacuation. Whether the stories were true or not, spacers gave it a wide berth. The nebular gases interfered with both sensors and communications, making it the perfect place to hide, or to die unobserved. The Wanderer approached through the swirling clouds of ionized gas, Kale navigating by instruments alone as visibility dropped to mere meters. Ancient docking clamps, green with corrosion and cosmic dust, accepted their ship with the grinding reluctance of machinery that hadn't been used in years. Atmospheric readings, Kyle asked as they prepared to board the station. Surprisingly stable, Aria reported. Emergency life support is still functional, though I detect trace amounts of the same exotic particles that comprise the nebula. Long-term exposure would be inadvisable. Good thing we're not planning to retire here, Cal muttered, checking his sidearm and slinging a bandolier of spare power cells across his chest. Liana moved through the Wanderer's small armory with surprising familiarity, selecting a pulse carbine and several thermal grenades. In the harsh light of the prep area, Cal could see that she was older than he'd initially thought. Not the young woman her delicate features suggested, but someone who had lived long enough to know weapons and warfare intimately. "How old are you?" he asked as they made their way to the airlock. "By your standards, approximately 160 years. She checked the charge on her weapon with practiced efficiency. Cthar lifespans are considerably longer than human ones. "I was already an adult when your species first achieved faster-than-light travel." The airlock cycled with a wheeze of ancient machinery, and they stepped into the tomb that had once been a functioning research station. Emergency lighting cast everything in sickly yellow relief, and their footsteps echoed through corridors that hadn't heard living voices in decades. Personal effects lay scattered where they had been dropped. A child's toy left behind by some researcher's family, a coffee mug with the station's logo still sitting on a desk, a hologram of a wedding party that flickered to life as they passed, projecting ghostly figures into the stale air before dying again. "What happened here?" Liana asked, pausing before a laboratory where sophisticated equipment lay in ruins, some pieces showing signs of deliberate destruction. "Classified," Kyle replied, but then reconsidered. If they were going to die here together, she deserved to know. Though the rumor mill says they were experimenting with psychotropic compounds extracted from deep space organisms, trying to create enhanced interrogation techniques for military intelligence. They paused in what had once been the main laboratory. Workstations lined the walls, their screens dark and lifeless. In the center of the room stood a massive containment chamber, its reinforced transverse steel walls cracked and stained with something that might once have been organic. "Test subjects went insane," Kyle continued, running his hand along the containment vessel. "Then the researchers, then the security staff. By the time a rescue mission arrived, they found nothing but corpses and madness. The whole project was classified and buried." Liana touched one of the workstations, and for a moment her expression grew distant. "My people have legends about places like this, worlds where scientists delve too deeply into the nature of consciousness itself. They say knowledge has a price, and some discoveries demand payment in blood and sanity." "Cheerful," Cal muttered, but he was already thinking tactically. "This room will work. Multiple entrances we can monitor and control. Good sight lines for defensive positions." Using his skills as both junker and former military engineer, Cal began setting traps. Tripwires made from salvaged cables, jury-rigged to bring down racks of heavy equipment, short circuits and wall panels that could be triggered remotely to plunge sections of the station into darkness, motion sensors positioned to give them advance warning of approaching enemies. Liana worked beside him, her alien senses far sharper than his damaged ones. She could hear the subtle shift of air currents through distant ventilation shafts, smell the faint traces of lubricants and metal that spoke of approaching machinery. Her hands moved with practiced precision as she cleaned her curved blade, a weapon that seemed to flow like liquid silver in the emergency lighting. "Tell me about him," Kyle said as they worked. "Vorlag." "He was my teacher," she replied, her voice growing soft with memory. "Found me when my abilities first manifested as a child. I was 12 years old, attending a cultural festival on my homeworld. There were thousands of people packed into the ceremonial plaza, celebrating the anniversary of our species' first contact with the galactic community." She paused in her work, the blade trembling slightly in her hands. "I was jostled by the crowd, frightened by the noise and confusion. And then, the change began. I could feel it building inside me like a pressure behind my eyes. The scent began to spread, and within minutes the entire plaza had descended into chaos. How many died? 347. The number came out flat, emotionless, but Kyle could see the weight of it in her eyes. Thousands more were injured. The authorities found me at the center of it all, unconscious from shock and terror. They would have executed me as a terrorist, but Vorlag intervened. He saved you. He contained me. The distinction was important to her. Took me to a remote monastery where I could learn control. Taught me meditation techniques, combat forms, Anything that might help me suppress the biological imperative written into my genes. For 30 years, I thought I had found peace. What changed? The Council of Purity learned of my existence. They declared me an abomination, a living weapon too dangerous to exist freely. Vorlag tried to protect me, argued that I could be valuable to our people if properly controlled, but the Council's decision was final. Her voice grew bitter. And Vorlag, loyal servant that he was, obeyed their orders. He was the one who placed the first chains on my wrists. As the station's night cycle descended and the chill of deep space began to seep through the hull plating, they huddled around an improvised heater made from laboratory equipment. The blue flames cast dancing shadows on the walls, creating the illusion of movement in the dead spaces around them. He taught me to read the stars, Liana continued, staring into the flames. Showed me how navigation was like meditation, finding your place in the vast emptiness through careful observation and discipline. And then he taught me how to kill silently, efficiently, without emotion. He said that control was beauty, that perfect discipline was the highest form of art. She looked up at Kyle, and in her ancient eyes he saw the child she had once been, frightened, alone, desperate for someone to tell her she wasn't a monster. I loved him like a father, she whispered. Even as he put the chains on me, I loved him. Is that not the cruelest irony of all? Kyle said nothing, simply passed her his thermal flask filled with hot stimulant concentrate. Sometimes silence carried more weight than words, and in the growing warmth between them, he sensed that she understood. Outside the station, hidden in the swirling gases of the poison nebula, death approached on swift wings. Vorlag's boarding party moved through the station like shadows given form and purpose. 10 Cathar warriors in matte black armor, deploying at different entry points with a coordinated precision that could only come from years of shared training and absolute trust in their leader's tactical genius. Their equipment was top tier, thermal imaging capable of detecting body heat through bulkheads, motion sensors that could track movement through interference and static, plasma weapons that could cut through reinforced barriers like tissue paper. Each warrior was a master of their craft, selected personally by Vorlag for their skill, discipline, and unquestioning loyalty. But more than their equipment or training, they carried with them the absolute certainty of their cause. To them, Liana was not a person to be rescued. She was a biological contamination to be cleansed, a mistake of evolution that threatened the purity of their species. In the station's central laboratory, converted now into a makeshift fortress, Liana's body went rigid as her enhanced senses detected what Kale's damaged ones could not. "They're here," she whispered, her voice barely audible even in the perfect silence of the abandoned research facility. Kale's hands moved to his weapons, checking charges and sight alignments with the automatic precision of a man who had survived too many battles to leave anything to chance. "How many?" 10. Moving in coordinated pairs through different sections. They're not rushing. Vorlag is being methodical, controlling the engagement on his terms. She closed her eyes, listening to sounds beyond human perception. "They've cut power to 3 of your motion sensors. 2 more just went dark." The first trap triggered with a crash that echoed through the station's halls, bringing down a rack of experimental apparatus on 2 warriors. Sparks flew in cascading showers as the second trap short-circuited the lighting in an entire section, plunging it into absolute darkness. But the Cathar were professionals, adapting to each setback with ruthless efficiency. Through the station's intercom system, a voice spoke, calm, measured, carrying the weight of absolute authority. "Liana, my student, you disappoint me." Cal saw her flinch as if struck. Whatever else Vorlag was, his voice still held power over her after all these years. "I taught you better than this," the voice continued, its tone more sorrowful than angry. "Hiding behind primitive defenses? Allying yourself with a lesser species? Have you forgotten everything about honor? About duty to your people?" "He's trying to get into your head," Kale said quietly. "Standard psychological warfare. Don't let him." But Liana was already responding, keying the intercom with trembling fingers. "I remember my lessons, mentor, including the one about questioning orders when they conflict with conscience." "Conscience?" Vorlag's laugh was like ice cracking. "You speak of conscience while consorting with the very humans whose mercenary fleets butcher our merchant vessels? While spreading your contamination through space like a plague?" The real fighting began in the narrow corridors leading to their sanctuary. Kyle used his knowledge of the station's layout like a weapon, luring enemies into dead ends where Liana could strike from unexpected angles. Her blade moved like liquid lightning, finding gaps in armor with surgical precision that spoke of decades of training. But there were too many of them, and they knew their business too well. Step by step, the defenders were driven back toward the central laboratory, leaving a trail of disabled traps and mounting desperation in their wake. "He's hurting us," Cal realized as they fell back to their final position. "This isn't about capturing you. It's about isolating you, making you face him alone." "Yes," Liana agreed, checking her remaining ammunition. "He was always the best strategist I knew." The laboratory door exploded inward in a shower of molten metal and superheated gas. Through the breach stepped a figure that dwarfed even the other Cathar warriors. Vorlag himself, his power armor decorated with ritualistic symbols that spoke of rank and authority earned through decades of service. He was massive for a Cathar, standing nearly 7 feet tall and built like a siege engine. His armor was archaic by current standards but perfectly maintained, each piece bearing scars from 100 battles. Most striking were his eyes, the same molten gold as Liana's, but cold as the space between stars. "My student," he said, removing his helmet to reveal a face that could have been carved from granite. "How far you have fallen?" "I have risen," Liana replied, stepping between Vorlag and Kale with her blade held ready. "For the first time in my life, I am free." "Freedom?" Vorlag gestured at the carnage around them, the dead station, the disabled Cathar warriors, the humans standing behind her with weapons drawn. "This is what you call freedom? Death and chaos and alliance with inferior beings?" "He saved me," she said, and there was steel in her voice now. When everyone else saw only a weapon to be contained, he saw a person worth saving. "He broke your chains and unleashed chaos upon the galaxy," Vorlag replied, his voice heavy with disappointment. "I have brought you new ones." He threw a set of chains identical to those that had bound her onto the laboratory floor. The metal links gleamed with the same oily substance, radiating chemical menace and the promise of decades more imprisonment. "Put them on willingly," Vorlag commanded, "and I may spare the human's pathetic life. Refuse, and I will ensure he dies slowly enough to appreciate the full measure of his error." Kyle could see the conflict warring in her golden eyes. Duty against freedom, the weight of a lifetime's conditioning against the first taste of genuine choice she had ever experienced. For a moment he thought she might actually comply, might surrender herself to spare him the consequences of his decision to free her. "No," she said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. Vorlag sighed with what might have been genuine sadness. "I thought as much. You always were too stubborn for your own good, even as a child." He activated a device on his wrist, and the air filled with a piercing, high-frequency whine that seemed to bypass the ears and attack the brain directly. Liana screamed, dropping to her knees as her body convulsed in agony. "A sonic inducer," Vorlag explained to Kyle with clinical detachment. "It causes extreme neurological stress in our species by disrupting the neural pathways responsible for emotional regulation. Quite harmless to other races, but for Cathar..." He gestured at Liana's writhing form. "And you know what happens when she experiences stress, don't you, human?" The air began to thicken again, that familiar acrid scent building to dangerous levels. Kale's damaged sinuses began to burn as the pheromonal cocktail reached concentrations he had never experienced before. Around them, the few surviving Cathar warriors suddenly stiffened as primitive instincts began overriding their training. But Vorlag himself seemed unaffected, protected by his sealed environmental suit. He stepped over the writhing bodies of his own men as they turned on each other with the same animalistic fury Kale had witnessed on the stasis. "You see?" Vorlag said, raising his armored boot above Liana's head. "This is what she is. Not a person, not an individual deserving of freedom or compassion. She is a biological weapon that turns civilization into chaos wherever she goes." "I always knew you were a monster," he continued, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "Now everyone will see the truth." Time seemed to stretch like taffy as Cal watched the scene unfold before him. The Cathar warriors killing each other in mindless rage, their discipline and training reduced to primitive fury. Vorlag's boot descending toward Liana's skull like the judgment of an angry god. Her body curled on the floor, racked with pain and guilt over the chaos that her very existence seemed to bring. And in that crystalline moment of perfect clarity, Kale understood something that changed everything. He didn't think, didn't calculate odds or consider tactics or weigh the consequences of his actions. He simply moved, charging forward into the epicenter of the pheromonal storm that was driving everyone else to madness. The chaos touched him like smoke, present but powerless. His damaged sinuses burned and his eyes watered, but his mind remained clear as he focused only on her. Vorlag turned, genuine surprise flickering across his granite features as he watched the human remain unaffected by the biochemical weapon that had reduced his elite warriors to rabid animals. Kyle ignored him completely. He dropped to his knees beside Liana and did the only thing his heart told him to do. He pulled her into his arms, holding her tight against his chest as her body shook with the force of her own power. And the storm stopped. Not gradually, not slowly, but all at once like a switch being thrown. Her trembling ceased. The thick, suffocating scent in the air began to dissipate like smoke and wind. Around them, the surviving Cathar warriors stumbled to a halt, confusion replacing rage as their higher brain functions reasserted themselves. Liana lifted her head, golden eyes wide with wonder and disbelief. "How?" she whispered. Physical contact. Kale's neural damage had made him more than immune to her pheromones. It had turned him into a kind of lightning rod, grounding her chaotic energy and giving her something stable to anchor herself to. But more than that, his presence seemed to provide her with the emotional stability she needed to control the biological imperative written into her genes. "I don't know," he admitted, helping her to her feet without breaking the physical connection between them. "But I'm not letting go." Vorlag stared at them both, his absolute certainty crumbling like sand. In his ancient eyes, Kale could see decades of conviction about Liana's monstrous nature being challenged by the simple reality of what he was witnessing. "Impossible," the Cathar commander breathed. "The contamination cannot be controlled. It cannot be contained without chemical suppressants and physical restraints." "Maybe," Liana said, rising to her feet with Kale's support. "You never tried the right approach." There was no more fear in her expression, no more self-loathing or acceptance of her supposed monstrosity, only cold, crystalline resolve in the calm that came from finally understanding her own nature. "You taught me that control was the highest form of art," she continued, her blade appearing in her free hand like liquid silver. "But you never understood that control cannot be imposed from without. It must come from within." Vorlag's response was swift and brutal. His plasma rifle came up in a blur of motion, but Liana was already moving. Together, she and Kale flowed like water around his attack, their movements synchronized as if they had trained for this moment their entire lives. Her deadly grace complemented his tactical cunning, creating a fighting partnership that was more than the sum of its parts. She struck high while he went low. He provided cover fire while she closed to blade range. When Vorlag's superior reach and armor threatened to overwhelm them, they moved as one, Cal's engineering knowledge allowing him to target weak points in the ancient power armor, while Liana's speed let her exploit the openings he created. They were no longer just allies. They had become a weapon forged in the fires of mutual trust and understanding. The battle was fierce but brief. Vorlag was a master warrior with decades of experience, but he was fighting against something he had never encountered before. Someone who knew his techniques because he had taught them to her, partnered with someone whose damaged mind was immune to her most dangerous ability. When it ended, Vorlag lay pinned beneath a collapsed piece of laboratory equipment, his armor cracked and sparking, but his life signs stable. He looked up at Liana with eyes that held something that might have been pride. "Perhaps," he said quietly, "I was wrong about what you are." Liana knelt beside her former mentor, her hand still clasped in Kyle's. "You were wrong about what I had to be," she corrected, "but you were right about one thing. I am dangerous. I always will be. The difference is that now I have a choice about how to use that danger." "And what will you choose?" She looked at Kale, then back at Vorlag. "I will choose to protect rather than destroy, to defend those who cannot defend themselves, to be the storm that breaks upon the enemies of the innocent." Vorlag nodded slowly. "Then you have become everything I hoped to teach you, and nothing I feared you were." He closed his eyes. "Go, my student, before the council sends others who will not be so easily convinced of your evolution." Epilogue: The Calm and the Storm. 1 year later, the refugee convoy stretched across half a light minute of space, but these weren't ordinary refugees. The ragtag collection of civilian transports and converted cargo haulers carried Cathar families, individuals who had been marked for purification by the Council of Purity. Genetic anomalies, political dissidents, and those deemed corrupted by association with other species. They were fleeing toward the neutral zones, seeking sanctuary from their own people's definition of purity, and they were being hunted. Incoming signatures on long-range sensors. Arya announced over the ship's communication system. 2 vessels, configuration consistent with Cathar Purifier-class cruisers. They're broadcasting surrender demands on all channels. On the bridge of the Wanderer, Kel smiled grimly as he activated the tactical displays. The pursuers were fanatics, true believers in the same ideology that had once chained Liana to a wall. They saw these refugees not as people, but as infections to be cleansed. Liana, he called over the internal comm, looks like the council found their lost sheep. Time to remind them why shepherds should fear wolves. Her laugh came back, warm and fierce, filled with the confidence of someone who had finally found her purpose. They want to see monsters, Calm? Let's show them what real monsters look like when they protect their own. Kyle checked his gear one more time. Pulse rifle, emergency medical kit, and most importantly, the small beacon transmitter that would let him stay in contact with her, no matter how chaotic things became. Around his neck hung a pendant she had made for him, carved from some crystalline material native to her homeworld. It served no practical purpose, but it reminded him daily that he was more than just a broken soldier turned scavenger. He was her anchor, her center, the calm at the heart of her storm. The purifier ships closed with the convoy like hunters stalking wounded prey, their advanced sensors already scanning for specific biosignatures. Their mission was simple: retrieve the corrupted for cleansing, eliminate any who resisted. They had not expected to find the storm waiting for them. Instead of the usual response, panic, scattered resistance, easy capture, Liana's transport detached from the convoy and accelerated toward the Cathar vessels with deadly intent. The cargo bay doors opened, and she stepped into the void wearing only a lightweight environmental suit and carrying a message that would resonate through Cathar space for generations. Through the refugee convoy's communication network, her voice reached every ship, every family, every person who had been told they were something less than pure. I am Liana of the 7th House, student of Master Vorlag, survivor of the purification. I was told I was a monster, a corruption, a disease to be burned out of existence. But I learned something in the darkness between stars. Monsters are not born, they are made. And today I choose to be the monster that protects the innocent, rather than the one that destroys them. She removed the pendant from around her neck, not just a simple ornament, but a precisely engineered delivery system containing a measured dose of her own pheromonal cocktail. The microscopic amount was harmless to her, but when released into the recycled atmosphere of the pursuing ships, the effect was immediate and devastating. Through the tactical feeds, Kale watched as the disciplined crews of the purifier vessels transformed into savage animals, their fanatical certainty replaced by primal fury. The ship's coordinated attack formation dissolved into chaos as bridge crews turned on each other. Weapon systems fired randomly, and the very ideology that had driven their hunt became meaningless in the face of biochemical chaos. Purification complete, Liana reported, her voice carrying a note of bitter satisfaction. The corrupted have been cleansed. Funny how that works. The refugee convoy continued its journey toward freedom, now protected by the very monster the Council had sought to destroy. And throughout Cathar space, word would spread of the storm that had risen from the ashes of their purification, turning their own weapons against them. Copy that, Storm, Cal replied, using the call sign that had spread throughout the outer rim. Nice work. Thank you, Calm. See you at home. Later, as the refugee convoy continued its journey toward sanctuary and the Wanderer hung in space nearby, Cal found Liana in their shared quarters. She was sitting by the viewport, watching the stars wheel slowly past, but her attention was focused on something else entirely. A small holographic display showing the faces of the families they had just saved. Do you ever regret it? She asked as he settled beside her, their hands finding each other automatically. Freeing me from those chains? Everything that's happened since? Kale considered the question seriously. They had fought the Council's forces across a dozen systems, become symbols of resistance to an entire species' definition of purity, made enemies of those who would cleanse the galaxy of difference, and heroes of themselves to those who had been marked for purification. Only one thing, he said finally. What's that? I regret that it took me so long to understand what you really are. And what am I? He looked at her, this woman who had been told she was a monster, a corruption, a disease to be burned out of existence, this woman who had chosen to become the protector of others like herself, turning her supposed curse into a shield for the innocent. You're not the monster they made you believe you were, he said quietly. You're the monster they created by trying to destroy you. The difference is, you chose to be the right kind of monster. She smiled and leaned against him, her presence as calming to him as his was to her. On the holographic display, Cathar refugees, families with children who would grow up free from the chains of imposed purity, continued their journey toward a new life. In the vast darkness between worlds, they had discovered something rarer than any treasure a junker might seek in the hulks of dead ships. They had found each other, and in doing so, proved that even monsters could choose love over vengeance, protection over destruction. And sometimes, late at night, when the nightmares came, memories of chains and violence, and the faces of those who had died because of what she was, Liana would remember that she was no longer alone in the dark. There was someone who would hold her when the storm inside threatened to break free. Someone who saw past the weapon to the person underneath. Someone who had chosen to stay, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. In the end, that made all the difference.